it is now my pleasure to introduce the speaker for our first presentation. And the title of the presentation is Considerations in Retrofitting a Facility After an Incident. Our speaker is Jim Voigt. Jim has 45 years of experience in the grain and feed industry, including 30 years with Archer Daniels Midland, where he was Vice President of Operations and Engineering for the Global Grain Division. Following his ADM career, Jim founded JFV Solutions Incorporated and Ag Consulting Services in Mount Zion, Illinois. JFV Solutions utilizes Jim's extensive working knowledge of operations, processes, and organizational structure, supply chain management, facility construction, and upgrade management. In addition, he handles labor safety, food safety, and environmental regulations. Voigt earned his Bachelor of Science degree in Agricultural Business Management from Cal Poly, graduating with honors. So let's welcome Jim for his presentation. Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. Good to see you here. This feels really awkward up here. Public speaking, you always kind of get a little nervous when you public speak. I think everyone does to a degree, but we haven't got together face to face for over a year, and I think that's adding a little more to the whole group. It's a different feel than what we've been experiencing. I was sitting at breakfast this morning, everyone was commenting, it's kind of awkward actually being able to sit at a table and talk to someone without a mask on or looking at them on a screen. So it's really good to be with here this morning. When Jess called me on this topic, I kind of go, well, why are you calling me, Jess? And then I got to thinking about, well, I'm probably, unfortunately, as qualified as anyone to speak to this subject. In all my years in the industry, I've obviously had a number of incidents that I've had to look at and evaluate and come back and figure out how we were going to move forward. With that being said, looking at our topic here, retrofitting a facility after an incident, how many of you have actively done that process that are in the room today? Raise your hands, please. So we got a few, and I guess that's a good sign. That means we must be doing things right if we don't have an incident, right? So with that, let's move on in. Oop, sensitive button. Start out with a little example. The photos you see here are Continental Grain in West Wego, Louisiana. And back in 1977, you see the bottom photo here. This is kind of what this facility looked like prior to the explosion. This is a little older than what it was, but it was that kind of design. As you can see, there were a major dust explosion in that facility. There were 35 fatalities, pretty much totally demolished that facility. And so Continental had to go through this process that we're going to talk about this morning. And when they did, if you look at the design you see here versus the design you see here, you can notice some major differences, okay? This had all enclosed tripper belts up in the head house there, or in the Texas house here. We had the classic house legs coming up through the head house. Well, Continental said, okay, we have a dust explosion. It followed our conveyance, our enclosed spaces, it followed our legs. So how do we get away from that in the future? And that's when they came with this incline belt design versus house legs, and they went to turn heads, exterior turn heads, instead of the enclosures with the tripper belts. So they completely rethought how export elevators should look. That design became the footprint for a lot of other facilities that were built later on. The other thing that came out of this was this section right here. Most of these 35 fatalities were federal grain inspection employees that perished in that explosion. And so OSHA got involved and started looking at our industry closer than they had in the past. There were a couple of explosions during the same period of time that also had fatalities. So what you guys are dealing with now, 1910-272, was born during this time frame. The next 10-year period after that, OSHA addressed how our industry needed to react and how we needed to change. So not only did we have to look at changes ourselves, but we had a regulatory agency looking at changes as well that we had to accommodate. So this is probably the classic example of somebody having an incident and then coming in and looking at a retrofit. Not only did they address the safety issues, they also addressed the efficiency issues in the design of this facility. So that's kind of what we want to go forward with here today. So I want to give a little background information before I get into it. I got about 3 case studies I want to share with you. But I want to look at incidents versus hazards. I want to look at the ramifications of an incident, a little bit on incident investigation and incident responses. Just get a little background information before we look at the case studies. So, a hazard. What is a hazard? We're going to have a session, I believe, at 10:30 this morning on hazard assessments. Is that correct, Jess? Yeah. So they're going to give you a lot more information on that, but for the purpose, a hazard is something that can cause harm, okay? We good with that? Then what is the risk? Risk is the chance or probability that that hazard will occur and how severe it's going to be, okay? And then the incident is also a hazard that has materialized. It's actually occurred, and we now have to respond to it. So, this can lead to disruption of your business. There could be injuries, there could be fatalities, a number of different possible outcomes from that incident. Typically, incidents, we have about 4 types. We have a major, which could be a total destruction like we saw in the Continental facility. We could have something that's repetitive that occurs. Maybe it's flooding issues or whatever. You can have some complex issues, and usually that gets involved where you may have to have some regulatory agencies involved, particularly environmental issues. And then we just have some minor incidents. Causes. What are the causes of most incidents? There's only a few really out there. Probably number 1 is human error, whether it's lack of training or shortcutting or whatever it may be. Maybe we have a design flaw. Equipment failure due to installation or whatever. Unfortunately, we now see intentional incidents that occur around the globe. And finally, it could just be an act of nature. So a little more on those possible outcomes of an incident. What happens when we have incidents? Depending on the severity and the type, we're going to have personal injury, loss of life, minor or major structure damage, business interruption. We could be partially or totally down for a period of time, which is going to be a loss of revenue. We could have additional expenses. Maybe we're having to work overtime to pick up something in the part of the facilities that are still running, or we got this huge mess to clean up. We're going to have labor to do that. Could be possible litigation, citations, depending on what the incident was. It might damage our reputation in our community or in the industry if it's something that we should have been able to take care of and we didn't. We may have morale issues with employees. A number of employees may not want to continue to work for us if we fail to do our jobs right. And it might impact the sustainability of our business model. We just may not be able to move forward once we've had this incident. So let's look real quick at incident investigation methodology. And I guess I put some information up on the slide. You can read it. But the thing we want to determine most is what was the root cause of the incident. Unless we go through that root cause investigation and know for sure what happened, how do we prevent it from happening again? So again, the ultimate goal of that incident investigation methodology is to determine root cause. Now, all investigations, incident investigations, have phases. I've got those listed there at the bottom. And, you should go through that. And you can see that, planning, obviously, anything we should do, we should plan. I mean, that's just good business. But we need to then, what is the scope of the incident? We need to identify that. We need to look at how do we contain that incident. Don't let it get worse than it already was. If I still got a smoldering bin, how do I keep that from becoming an explosion? And then how do I eradicate or correct the results of that and recover from that incident and then learn from it to go forward? When I do this incident investigation, who do I want doing it? Okay? Whoever does that should have the knowledge and experience to conduct that. We just shouldn't throw a body out there because they have a title. Do they understand what happened? That could be someone internal in your organization. You may have a regulatory agency, or you may have a state fire marshal in there doing that investigation. Or you might hire a third-party service to come in and do that, or a combination of the three. But whoever is doing that, searching out that root cause, be sure they have the knowledge and experience to really find the true cause. So, some elements of incident response plan. Basically, it's the old simple who, what, when, where, why kind of investigation you need to look at. But we want to look at what was going on during the time of the incident. What was running, what was not running, who was working, what procedures were in place. External factors, what was the weather, what was the volume of business, were we receiving, were we shipping, what was happening. We want to get all those facts down during that. And we want to make sure it's facts. We don't want to make decisions off of I think or we probably were. We deal with facts when we do incident investigations. And if we don't deal with facts, we can't find the root cause, okay? And that's where we really want to get. So once we have that root cause determined, then we can look at potential corrective actions. What we can do in the future to prevent this from happening. And then we evaluate each of those, select the best alternative, and then we start that process and implement our corrective actions. So at this point, we're going to hit a crossroad. We've identified our root cause. We've determined some potential actions. We've got a list of possible alternatives. But again, here we can make a decision. Are we going to go back status quo? Is it going to look like it was before the incident? Or are we going to take the opportunity provided to us and go in and make some changes? Those changes could be a number of different types of changes. They could be safety-related changes. We're going to address all that catwalk, canwalk, ladder issues we had. All those to access to equipment. Maybe we can eliminate some confined spaces. We're going to look at those type of things. Then we're also going to look at efficiency issues while we're going back as well. You know, part of this process is we have to get our business back up and running, but we need to look at where's the payback for spending some of this money. So this opportunity allows us to be somewhat visionary and look at new approaches rather than just going back status quo. So just back up one step here. First, we're going to have some immediate things to address from that incident. We're going to have some personnel needs. Did we have anybody hurt? We have to obviously take care of those folks. We got some people who maybe have some mental issues, if you will, or PTSD, whatever type of issues. I know we've had explosions, had employees who would not step foot back in a concrete elevator. They'll work outside in a corrugated facility, but they want to know part of a concrete facility in the future. So we need to address those type of issues. We're probably going to have some regulatory issues somewhere in this, whoever it may be, okay? We need to address those up front as well. Operationally, can we still operate? Are there some things we can do safely while we're rebuilding this facility or getting it, evaluating it, that we can continue to generate some revenue? Which, though, all these things are going to affect us financially and from a PR standpoint. So make sure we address those issues first. And then, like I was saying earlier, then let's look at that future. Are we returning to the status quo? Okay? When we come back, are we to do a partial upgrade? A total upgrade? How do we want this thing to look in the future? We have to have a process to do that. So, we've all heard that phrase, let's think out of the box. Well, this is a classic time to explore that concept of thinking out of the box. Most of our facilities all have similar designs. There weren't that many people designing facilities when they were built, and they have a lot of similarities. I've probably been in 1,500 grain and feed facilities in my career. They have a lot of similarities how we do things. So when you look at your facility, it is unique, it has unique needs, so you need to look at how am I going to address those needs. So think about taking advantage of this from a positive or a positive approach versus a reactive approach. How can I make this better going forward? Am I satisfied with what it was, or do I want to go to what it can be? So with that, we're going to set some new goals. There'll be short-term, long-term goals, and just real quick on goal setting, your goals should be smart. They should be specific, measurable, attainable, should be relevant, and timely, okay? I had the opportunity in years past to go through the Lean Six Sigma continuous improvement training. One of the things Lean in particular hammers home to you when you're looking at facilities is voice of the customer concept. Sometimes our industry, we haven't done a good job of that. We get set in our ways, and we haven't really looked at the environment, what's going on around us. Who's hauling grain into you now? Where's that grain going when it goes out? I would guess it's different than it was 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago when your facility was probably built, or older. So we're looking now, we want to look at that voice of the customer. What does your customer need out there? Not what they want, but what do they need, okay? And we want to look at not only present, but the future. Good business practices, you should have already had an evaluation of your facility somewhere on file. You should do that on an annual basis. What are the capacities of my facilities? What are its capabilities? Where are my bottlenecks? What are causing issues? And again, where are your concerns from a safety standpoint? Where are you having injuries? Where are you having your near misses? What are causing those types of problems, okay? We should know those things. Again, we're going to have this session on hazard assessment. They're going to address that in detail, making those type of evaluations. We not only need to look at that from a facility standpoint, we need to look at our procedures as well. When we had this incident, was the way we did things, was that the root cause of this problem? Okay. Or was it a personnel issue? Did we have someone out there who wasn't trained properly? We hadn't done our job in providing that training and proving that employee comprehended what we were telling him. Or did we have a supervisor under pressure? Got to get that train out. We shortcutted something. So we need to look at all those areas when we're evaluating for improvement. Okay, so I've lectured you guys enough here on the background for all this. Let's take a look at 3 case studies I want to share with you. The first one's going to be a dust explosion that was in a smaller concrete facility that resulted in total destruction of the facility. The second one will be a structural bin failure with the loss of the bin and a nearby dryer. And the third one will be an entrapment incident that we'll take a look at. One last thing I wanted to throw in before I got into this is I mentioned earlier that we are going to have an expense probably of clearing this site after an incident, depending on what it was. That can be timely, take a lot of time. It can be very labor intensive. It can be very costly depending on the incident. But one of the things when you get into that process is look at what permitting's required for that. Particularly if we've got debris to remove, is it going to be classified as hazardous or not? So we need to check with all the appropriate regulatory agencies that we're dealing with that we have the permits to do what we need to do. You can get some emergency permitting in a lot of cases, but do we need, on the rebuild side, are we going to need construction permits and eventually operating permits? Environmental permits sometimes can take a long time to get, and more than likely you're going to have to deal with some of those issues. So let's take a look at case study number 1 here. All right, so this was a smaller concrete facility, 4 concrete bins with some interstices, truck pit, conveyance, dryer, had a dryer, and, normal stuff you'd see. We had a dust explosion in this facility that resulted in 5 fatalities and 2 injuries out of this. Completely destroyed the facility. It appeared someone had came in and had it imploded it. There was nothing standing. OSHA did an investigation on that facility. They found no reason to issue any citations. We did have some environmental issues during that the fire department was in performing, wasn't a rescue, it was a recovery situation. Very quickly they determined. So we had some water runoff and some other things that were going into the adjacent waterway. Definitely business interruption. The facility was completely gone. As there was no OSHA citation, there was no fines, there was no criminal cases filed, but we had some civil suits filed for loss of life. And then the hazardous debris removal. The root cause here, through our own investigation, we went through that facility top to bottom. That facility is probably one of the cleanest, well-maintained facilities I've seen in my career. We were just kind of scratching our head and tracing the pattern of the explosion and everything. We made the determination that we've got some type of ignition source came in through the truck pit, whether it was a hot bearing on a truck or whatever. The minute it hit the inside house leg, it popped. And that was our root cause. When we did our analysis on this facility, the first thing we looked at after taking care of all those immediate issues where I had up front, taking care of people and all those things, we looked and reviewed the facility's history. So this thing was marginally economically profitable. It didn't really have the opportunity to expand their business model to get more business in there. We had a nearby facility that we could easily divert business to. This facility was located in a fairly urban area, so logistics getting in and out of it were somewhat difficult. We had neighbor complaints in the past on noise and dust. The cost of rebuilding in this area was higher than most because of its location. We got into issues with some of the trade unions from a union perspective on construction. So when we weighed all the information out, this particular facility, the decision was made not to rebuild. So then we got into just removing the rubble and all the safety issues, environmental issues related with that. Rubble removal can be quite hazardous. I think we've seen in the news here recently the collapse of the condominium down in Florida. Their biggest concern was taking care of the people in there, their first responders, so they weren't injured. And so they took that neighboring structure down. Anytime you have a site that's had some type of incident, there's potential for further incidents. So we really need to think about that. Okay, let's look at case study number 2. Okay, we had a 105-foot diameter tank, had structure failure in the wall, spilling grain onto adjacent dryer and knocking the dryer from the foundation. So when we did our investigation on this facility, we found some bin wall, major cracks there. Obviously, the bin walls were gone, the roof was gone, anchor bolts had pulled loose from the foundation. All that top conveyance and truss when the bin collapsed, that was all damaged, electrical damage. Reclaim systems were undamaged. We did have a few cracks in the tunnel walls. Aeration system was damaged, fans were gone on one side. The adjacent dryer was knocked and pretty well destroyed. Then, of course, we had lots of usable space and loss of drying capacity. Fortunate thing about this incident where there was no injuries. There wasn't anybody in the area when it occurred. The root cause we determined was improper unloading of the bins. This bin had ran down, but not far enough where we should have been pulling from some of the outside gates. And when we started pulling on the outside gate or discharge gates, we put pressure on the walls where they weren't designed to have pressure, and down she came. Another thing we found in our investigation was we had insufficient wind rings. This bin, I believe, only had, I think it was 15 or 16 wind rings on it. This was a working bin. We weren't just filling it and using it once a year. It was being cycled, so we should have probably structurally had more support for that. We also found that we had uneven settling in the foundations, and we did a little historical check on that and found when we did the soil work on that bin, when it was built, the adjacent waterway had a very high water table that was unusually high, and so we probably didn't get accurate soil boring results. When the water table was seeded and down to the normal level, the soils reacted differently. And we've also found that the foundation, while it was meeting the codes, it was marginally meeting those codes and probably should have been a little heavier for the way we were using the bin. So again, we looked at our analysis. This facility had good volume. It justified putting some money back in the facility. We had the potential to expand our market share here. We did also look at this facility. We did have to go to the ground, so storage was important to us. We had a return on investment on storage. We saw that this facility, as it was built, had a tenth of CFM, which, if we're going to put wheat or beans in it, was probably fine, but we usually used it as corn storage. So a tenth is pretty marginal for corn storage. Our drying capacity had been maxed out. This dryer was damaged. We were losing dryer opportunities. We found out the fill conveyor up on top was a bottleneck for us. It wasn't matched to the capacity of the leg, so we couldn't use the full capacity of the leg because of the conveyor going into the bin. We started looking at, new dryers and things and larger dryers, and we quickly found our natural gas supply wasn't going to be large enough to put a new dryer in until we changed that out. So the other thing we looked at was, okay, we're going to have the facility down. We're going to be doing this rework in here. We're going to have contractors in here. We're going to have cranes in here. What else can we do while we have that to take advantage of it? So we looked at some other issues for the facility. So the outcome was we replaced that bin, okay? So we made repairs to the foundation, including some mud jacking to level things up. We added additional wind rings on that bin, repaired the floor cacks, anchor bolts, tunnels. From an upgrade, we matched our capacity to the facility. We bumped our aeration to 7th CFM, modified floor decks, upgraded electrical, upgraded drying capacity. Okay. From a safety perspective, we looked at our access out to these bins when we were working on them. What was our walkways, what's our emergency ladders, cages, all those things. So we took our current code at the time and made sure when we did those retrofits that from a condition standpoint, we were meeting all those in the rebuild. The other thing we looked at was from a people perspective, okay? So we realized in our cause that this was a human error unloading the bin incorrectly. So we went back and looked at all our procedures and realized that maybe we hadn't done the proper training for those employees. This particular employee involved was a seasonal employee. Grab a warm body and throw them in there at harvest time type of thing. We really haven't given them, we gave them instruction, but we really never really verified they comprehended the instructions and what would happen if they didn't follow them. So we had to rewrite our orientation program for new employees, heavy emphasis on safety, and we changed our standard operating procedures on how we unload bins. Okay? So the third one is entrapment. Here we had an employee made a bottom entry into a 90-foot diameter tank to clear a sweet auger sump that was plugged. In our investigation, we found they didn't follow lockout tagout. Grain was being pulled by an employee made that entry, and there was material hung on the walls over the employee's head. These incidents I'm sharing with you are back in the 1980s, okay? I hope today we're much wiser than this, and nobody's describing the incident I'm describing here today. Okay. So, what did we find? We had grain in that bin that was out of condition. It hadn't been properly conditioned when it was put in the bin. We had clumps. We had material hanging on the sidewalls. The clumps obviously are blocking the sump holes as we're trying to clean this thing out. We had no bin entry permit used. The employee, we've discovered, had not been trained in bin entry or lockout tagout. There was not an observer present. We did have one of the early zero sweeps. Again, this is the 80s, and in the 80s, there never really truly was a zero sweep, but we'd like to think it was. We had all the sumps open in the bin. The employee was entrapped. We were able to get the employee out, but there was definitely some emotional issues and some respiratory issues, some lost time. There was an OSHA investigation, a citation. There was a civil suit. We had a lot of additional expenses, loss of revenues. We wound up having a couple other employees quit because of the safety procedures that weren't being followed. They just didn't feel safe coming to work anymore, which ultimately had a damage to the company's reputation. The root cause, we had inadequate procedures. We had inadequate drying capacity at the front end. We shouldn't have, putting the hot, wet grain we were putting in there. Definite lack of training and inadequate supervision. So we had multiple root causes in this situation, which just compounded themselves and piled on top of each other. So again, looking at the facility analysis-wise, it's a good volume. We could afford to put some money back in this thing. We found that management was not focused on safety. They were worried about efficiency. They were worried about costs. They were about revenue. Safety was way down the list. It would be at that time that Mr. Frizzell, sitting over here, became the safety guy for our grain division. So we had failure to follow some written procedures, failure to provide training, failure to provide adequate supervision, and we also looked at some of the efficiency issues on this facility while we're looking at that, the grain drying capacity and some of the other things. So what were the outcomes? We replaced the facility manager. I mean, even though we were in the 80s, we had always said the magic word safety first. Did we make an example of this guy? Yeah, probably we did. Right or wrong, that's what we did. We retrained the rest of the facility supervision. We did a total review of our procedures, particularly the bin entry procedures, match them up with what was the accepted industry standard as well as any regulatory standards that were in place at the time. I said we acquired a grain rescue tube and associated equipment. Well, at the time this happened, the tubes weren't actually out there. We actually wound up, but we developed a plywood system that would do the same thing, and those worked. We started establishing annual training with our first responders in our facilities because we found first responders showed up and they didn't have a clue what they were walking into when they hit the door. So we just said, let's get these guys out here once a year. Let's feed them some pork chops, let them practice carrying their hoses up and down, whatever they want to do, and get them familiar with our facility, familiar with our hazards, and familiar with our people. We completely retrained our workforce, not only at this facility, but throughout the organization. We started to develop more intense programs, more specific programs than some of the generic stuff we had in place at the time that cut and paste out of a book somewhere. Particular emphasis on seasonal employees. These are the guys, there's two groups that are at great risk. You get that employee that's been there 6, 8, 10 years who gets very comfortable in what they're doing, starts shortcutting things. But you have that new employee that you're just pulling off the street, may or may not have ever been in a grain elevator before. And we give them, here, work with this guy for 2 or 3 days and turn them loose. We can't do those type of things. We have to have specific training for that employee, addressing all the hazards they're going to be exposed to and how they can work safely doing that job to eliminate the hazards. And then we reviewed and updated our grain handling procedures. How we were drying, how wet a corn we were storing, how warm it could be, coring, was that bin properly cored? And we reviewed our aeration. Do we have adequate air for what we were trying to do with that facility? And then we looked at upgrading our dryer capacity and address those issues. When you have incidents like this, you need to take advantage of the opportunities. I've got a contractor in there, I may have a crane in there, whatever. Have I got other issues here? I'm on the west end of my facility and I'm putting all these new catwalks and ladders and things in on the rebuild. I get the same problems over on the east end. Well, I got the guys there, let's look at those and address those issues as well. Not only looking at today, but looking in the future, looking at that voice of the customer. What are you going to need in the future? Okay? When I change my facility to meet that future demand or needs, I'm also going to create new risk, new hazards for my employees. Part of that process is coming up with a plan not only for a rebuild, but coming up with a plan for how I can get my employees home safely every day. So in summary with this thing, we want to look at root causes, determine potential alternatives and actions, evaluate current and future needs, that voice of the customer. Part of that voice of the customer is the safety of our employees. You can actually look at your employee as a customer almost from a safety perspective. Compare status quo to the future needs, evaluate for improvement, and then establish your new goals. So with that, I'll open it up with any questions, or anyone wants to share some stories of their own. Well, I appreciate your attention this morning. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed it.
Oh, I'm sorry, I just wasn't sure if I was going to ask it or not. So, hailing back to your case study number 2 in regards to the bin incident.
Yes.
So, y'all talked a little bit about root causes and that you found that the ground wasn't adequate for the foundation for the bin.
Right.
So, I'm assuming y'all didn't do your own work, a contractor did.
Yes.
So, did that result in future times dealing with contractors having greater expectations for their delivery of the project?
Well, we bid things probably a little different than a lot of people. Given the scope of work we did a lot of work.
Right.
So probably had different relationships with contractors than most folks did. What we did do, though, is we used an independent soil engineering firm that did most of our work, and we changed procedures on how we were doing those types of analysis. As far as impacting the contractors doing the erection work and thing, it really was minimal. That was something we did ourselves on the front end. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I guess. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Jess?
I have a question. So just curious, some of these case studies involve an OSHA citation,
Yes.
right? So were they a federal OSHA, were they a state plan?
Federal.
And how much did that play, the citation, play into the changes that were made, right? I know in some cases,
I'm going to, just during the time period these occurred, not a lot. Again, these were primarily in the 80s. The citations were easily reduced in negotiation at that time. There wasn't any lasting impact from the agency at that time. It's not the same environment we live in today.
So in your role then now, and issues you've been involved with, how much of a role does a citation play?
Huge, huge. I've got a couple of my clients that I'm working with as a consultant right now that had major situations, and that's probably number one priority when we're addressing these issues is the regulatory side.
Did everyone hear that? The questions I had, sorry, did everyone hear that? Okay, good.
Yeah.
I think there was one over
And that case number 2, was that first year use of that bin, or?
No, it was not. It was probably 6 or 7. The settling over the years caught up with us. And again, that bin wasn't being filled just once a year. It was being cycled. Yes?
Related to Jeff's question, do you have any recommendations, clients, on how you handle root cause investigation? You also have an OSHA investigation going on.
I mean, what we have found to work is we've had clients will use their legal services will contract us, so there's confidentiality on our studies. That's one method you can do. You can conduct your own internal investigations, and depending on what OSHA asks for, you only have to give them what they ask for.
And also, following up on that, on the citations, I know we're talking primarily about OSHA. Was there anything involved in any, you mentioned one of the, to have the water, the runoff?
Yes.
Any of these involving the EPA and OSHA?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
So you were having to deal with some of these cases, you're having to deal with both the federal OSHA and
Yeah, and where we found some of the permitting issues that I mentioned were really are environmental, disposing of debris, some of it classified as hazardous, and the surface runoff. You get a fire department in there spraying a lot of water and foam and other things, and it's got an adjacent waterway, you've got some issues.
And so how much role did the NOV that you received from EPA play in what you were doing?
EPA was kind of a upfront issue we could deal with as far as long-term impact. The surface runoff, water runoff rules were being, introduced at that time, and obviously we tried to address those, but it wasn't near the same as it was over with OSHA. Any other questions? Well, I appreciate your attentive this morning, and if any of you have something come up when you get home and you're thinking about this, you'll have access to this, but feel free to call me and gladly talk through some things with you. So thank you very much.